Everybody, thank you. We're going to have more people coming in, and thank you for everyone who is watching online. Welcome back after the lunch break. I am Lori Wallach with the Rethink Trade Program of AELP, and I am just going to kick off the panel because we have an incredibly special moderator who is also sort of the keynoter. And so I'm going to introduce someone who kind of needs no introduction, and she will introduce the rest of us. Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who represents Connecticut's 3rd District. And as I often say, she's sort of like the person who needs no introduction, because everyone who isn't even following politics says, oh, that's an amazing lady with the amazing hair who took millions of kids out of poverty with the child tax credit. She's that lady who keeps the government from not shutting down and keeps stopping the Republicans from cruel and devious cuts to our basic programs. That is who will be moderating here today. But most people don't know she also chairs the House Trade Working Group, which is a very long-standing, since NAFTA, collaboration of members of Congress and unions and other outside groups. And we can also thank Congresswoman DeLauro for saving us from the TPP, yes, and making Trump renegotiate his renegotiated NAFTA to put in the labor standards that Thea is going to talk about, among other things. So all-around rock star and our chair, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro.
Well, thank you, Lori. My God. Let's go on the road with this show here, Lori. Thank you very, very much. And I'm so delighted to be able to join with all of you today. And I want to say a thank you to the American Economic Liberties Project, organizing the panel, and really helping to shine a light on what is a growing need for a 21st century approach to trade, that one recognizes the missteps of the past, but also is identifying a strategy for us for the future. Joined today by Thea Lee, Deputy Undersecretary of Labor for International Affairs, the U.S. Department of Labor, Scott Paul, President of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, and the indomitable Lori Wallach, Director of Rethink Trade for the American Economic Liberties Project. And I might just say that Lori talked about our journey with TPP, but the gang's all here when we embarked on that effort, and also the renegotiated NAFTA agreement. I find it hard to say the USMCA, so I talk about it as the renegotiated NAFTA agreement. These folks are really public intellectuals. They have a long, long history of addressing this issue, but all trade issues. And we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts, how we can, in fact, advance a more progressive, a more worker-centered trade policy for this country. Let me just say a few words, if I can, about how I view this issue. This is an issue that's really near and dear to my heart. And I've staked my career on it in many ways. And Lori mentioned this. I fought and helped organize in the Congress the opposition against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Because I saw what the earlier trade deals did, how they hollowed out the American middle class, our manufacturing capacity. I watched shuttered factories in my own district, weakened communities, et cetera, across this country. And TPP would have tilted the balance in favor of massive corporations even further, allowing them to set the rules for themselves, creating a race to the bottom on wages, environmental standards, and consumer protection. And let me just say that it was no easy road to be up against the full strength of the administration. But a collective effort, an effort that was so needed and undertaken by this group of people, and some who are here, in the audience, and we succeeded at doing that. I recognize, as I believe we all do, the value of international trade. I think, its role in both increasing our prosperity for working people, protecting global stability, but it has to be done right with purpose and with forethought. When you get self-interested corporations, they should not be allowed to write all of the rules. And Lori pointed out, yes, they should be allowed to do all the rules. I worked with the Trump administration to rewrite the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Look, I'm prepared to work with anyone who will come to the table with serious ideas of how to conduct trade while we protect American jobs and our ability to maintain high-skilled labor and talent. The fight has always been about corporate power. When corporations run amok, as they did in the 1990s, when what they did was they latched onto a strategy of using trade negotiations to lock in the rules to protect themselves, expand their power while limiting government oversight. They pushed for investor protection. They made it easier to deal with offshoring, and they shot down any of the provisions that would allow us for stronger labor standards. And it was limiting government oversight, and at every step of the way, who lost here was the middle class and workers. They lost at every turn. And the companies used the negotiations to craft the rules that limit competition. And look, they're restricting generic drug competition to protect the pharmaceutical patents. And they were counting on, which has changed, and we'll get to talking about that, lax antitrust enforcement that cannot compete with the power of increasingly consolidated corporations and the legal defense teams that they had put together. But what's the good news? Finally, I believe we are at a turning point on trade and antitrust. We have the best chance in decades to really try to make significant changes to how we conduct our policy today and our corporate power. It's both home and abroad. You know, I think the Biden administration has empowered our trade and antitrust officials. Look, FTC Chair Lina Khan, what a hell of a job she is doing at this, and it's a pleasure to work with her. Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Kantner at the Department of Justice. Yes, you know, this is advancing bold worker-focused strategies rather than a corporate one. Utilizing the rapid response mechanism that we fought for in the renegotiated NAFTA agreement to hold trading partners accountable for labor violations. You know, and this has recently been used to remedy violations of labor law at facilities in Mexico that are manufacturing products as wide-ranging as garments, automobiles, rubber. They have also gone after some of the largest tech monopolies who are serial abusers of U.S. digital trade policy, applied targeted tariffs to combat Chinese product dumping strategies on crucial areas of clean energy technologies. You know, the administration, 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles that are undercutting American manufacturers and workers. So after years of skyrocketing corporate profits gained from the global race to the bottom on trade, I believe we are finally seeing momentum, and that is starting to shift. People are realizing that we have more tools at our disposal to fight the trend than we thought, and international corporations are not immune to the law. From outbound investment screening to closing the custom loopholes, Earl Blumenauer and de minimis, you know, fighting to keep drugs like fentanyl out of the country. So there are opportunities ahead. We're going to review the renegotiated NAFTA agreement in 2006. How will it better help us to rethink bringing workers and consumers, small business, and environment to the center of our agreements? We have to continually raise the bar. What we mostly have to do is that we have to make it clear to the most profitable American consumer markets that it requires more from them than bare minimum of social responsibility. It is a bare minimum, no longer good enough. So, and finally, we must reimagine how the deals are negotiated. In the past, we went crazy during TPT with the secrecy around the negotiations, terrible fast-track procedures, hundreds of corporate lobbyists, executives in the room, while labor unions, climate advocates, consumer watchdogs on the sideline. If we want our trade deals to reflect the needs and the interests of the American people, then they must have a seat at the table. And just make two comments about we need to be in the room where it happens, and if you are not at the table, you're on the menu. So we need to really understand that. Trade is good, But like any good thing, without guardrails, it is disastrous. I look forward to a new era of trade policy that recognizes this fact, puts people, not corporations, in charge of our vision. And now I've gone on long enough for you to hear from me, but we need to hear from the experts here who are arrayed today. And what I'm going to do is, I think the general ways, I will ask each of our panelists a question and then a general question and follow up from there, and hopefully there may be time for audience questions. Let me go to my dear, dear friend, the Deputy Undersecretary, Thea Lee. You were engaged in the NAFTA fight. Yes, in the early 1990s, you wrote about how a trade agreement model that placed corporate interests first had, and I quote, hidden costs for workers. Now we are 30 years later. We've seen several other significant changes to the global trade order, the formation of the WTO, the granting of permanent normal trade relations to China, and many other free trade agreements. What has been, in your view, the outcome of corporate trade models for working people and for the U.S. economic resilience writ large? What has been the result of all of this?
Well, thank you so much, Rosa, and what a pleasure to be here with Lori Wallach and Scott Paul, two titans of the trade debate. So this is a great pleasure, but you know, we were there in the early 1990s. I was working at the Economic Policy Institute at the time, and you know, the premise was, should trade agreements be just for corporations? Should they be just for multinational corporations to have more power and more wealth and more flexibility and more mobility than they already had? Or were there other considerations at stake? And, you know, at the end of the day, I think we were proven right.
Amen.
I don't always like to say, you know, I told you so, but we did. We told them so.
Exactly.
And the outcome was job loss in the millions. I mean, not just from NAFTA, but from the China PNTR and from the other trade agreements, that we hollowed out our manufacturing sector. We hollowed out communities across the United States of America. And we had a complete rupture of resilient supply chains. And we saw that particularly during COVID, where all of a sudden, like who knew, we couldn't make ventilators, we couldn't make personal protective equipment, and we were dependent on a somewhat hostile trading partner, China, to deliver things that we needed for our lives, for our live existence. And now we're seeing also the same kind of thing with respect to clean energy supply chains, where we made through corporate globalization, some kind of short-sighted choices maybe 10 years ago, like, hey, let's just buy it cheaper from China. Who needs to produce things here in the United States of America? And now we are finding that those supply chains are fatally tainted with forced labor in many cases, with actual slave labor. Mm-hmm. And we are faced with this horrible choice. Are we supposed to continue with deployment of solar panels and electric vehicles at the cost of slave labor, or do we have to stop and think back again? And, you know, this administration is going in the other direction. But so the outcomes were atrocious in terms of the manufacturing sector and our ability to produce. But it wasn't just the number of jobs, it was the quality of jobs. That good quality unionized manufacturing jobs were lost, and they weren't replaced with very much. And if you think about it, it was really by design. This was corporate power, corporate ambition and overreach, that they glommed onto the idea of the trade agreement, and NAFTA was kind of the embodiment of all of that. And they used it to further an agenda of anti-regulation, anti-taxation, anti-union, anti-environment policies. And so they fundamentally undercut democracy. And that is, I think, why we were able to build a really powerful coalition. It was a multinational coalition. It wasn't us against Mexico or against Canada. It was worker activists, environmentalists, civil society activists, human rights activists in Mexico and Canada and the United States coming together. And over time, I think that really served us well, because that's why we always had a vision of what trade agreements could be, or what trade policy could be, that was not just about maximizing profits and corporate power. But if you think about it, of course, in today's conference, it's about shifting the balance of bargaining power. That there is already an inherent imbalance of power between employers and workers. You know, the employers have the capital, they own the factory, the workers have their own labor to offer. And when you think about taking globalization on top of that, you can magnify it 1,000 times. So now you take a multinational corporation, one of the wealthiest entities in the world, and you put it against a worker who might be illiterate, who came out of the rural areas, who's never held a job before, doesn't know what their rights are. And that tremendous imbalance of power is exactly what corporations were looking to, that it wasn't good enough for them. That in the United States of America they'd already beaten back unions, that they'd already taken away a lot of jobs. They wanted more power. They wanted the power to go and to force governments to compete with each other for the scraps of the global economy. Whether developing country governments, desperate for jobs, desperate for foreign investment, having to offer up weaker regulation, less taxes, busted unions in order to attract investment. So, at the end of the day, if you contrast what was in NAFTA and the trade agreements of that era with what was not in, I think you see a very clear picture. So there were strong protections for intellectual property rights, for pharmaceutical companies, for copyrights, as you said, Rosa. There were strong protections in terms of financial flows, that the big money corporations needed to be able to move their money around without any barriers, without any hiccups. And, of course, the investor-state dispute settlement, which empowered individual foreign investors to sue governments over regulations they didn't like. And I'm sure Laurie will talk a little bit more about that. And then on the other side, you see almost nothing for labor and environment. So the labor and environmental side agreements were so pathetic and weak. We at the AFL-CIO, I ended up at the AFL-CIO, tried to use those agreements for a couple of decades, but there was no dispute settlement. There was no remedy at the end of the day. So you can spend tens of thousands of dollars getting the workers to testify, showing some egregious abuses of workers' rights that were happening in Mexico with American companies or multinational companies, and at the end of the day, there were no teeth to it. And that was by design. So, it was just the contrast between weaponizing the market access. And if you think about it this way, the corporations were selling off access to the U.S. consumer market to the highest bidder. And they were doing it in a way and on terms that were uniquely favorable to multinational corporations and uniquely damaging to worker power, to environmental protections, to even to consumer protections, because they got the governments of the global South and the labor movements and the activists to have to compete for scraps while they strengthened and embedded their own protections and trying to reduce the risk of outsourcing by locking in market access, locking in low tariffs, locking in investor protections that had not existed before and don't exist in any democratic government, and then forcing governments to compete by keeping taxes low, keeping regulations weak, not enforcing labor protections, and busting unions. So that was the end of the day. It was a sad picture, but I know we're going to go to a brighter place as this conversation evolves. Thank you, Rosa.
Well, thank you, Thea. Excellent, excellent. Just a couple of points. We did tell them that. We told them so. And I can recall, I don't know if some of you can remember as well, that those of us in the Congress who were opposed to NAFTA and spoke out about it, and I'll be very, very clear, the Clinton administration said we were thugs. That's the way we were described, as thugs. But it was each of the questions. The outcome was atrocious, and I love this as shifting the balance of bargaining power, which is what this is really all about. Let me move to Scott, if I can. From your vantage point, what's the impact on manufacturers? The impact on the U.S. industrial base? Did this corporate-led NAFTA style work for all businesses?
Thank you, Rosa, and it's great to be Congresswoman
Rosa,
DeLauro.
I wasn't baptized.
I have been lucky to have my foot in all of these communities for a long time with Capitol Hill and the trade movement, and so I feel very blessed that way. So in one way, it worked very well for corporations because the shareholder value went up tremendously as they were able to practice this labor arbitrage and have these investments locked into place and not have much of a fear that they'd be removed. So it worked quite well for global wealthy companies until it didn't, and I'll get to that. It didn't work very well for the rest of us, and for companies that were committed to try to produce in the United States. They were undercut by these agreements in a number of different ways. And certainly for working people who were seeking union representations at these facilities, these trade agreements could now be used as a cudgel against them, and it made it eroded bargaining power that way. And the economic evidence that has been, I think, presented over the last 3 decades now, there were a lot of rosy predictions about how these trade agreements would turn out, that the kind of orthodox economic community was purporting about, like NAFTA would create all these jobs, all these companies would move their production to the United States, not from it, and then rinse and repeat for all of these other agreements, whether it was China or with Central America or the TPP. And what actually happened when you look at, when you review all the predictions that were made, the work that, for instance, the Economic Policy Institute did and other institutions was much more aligned with the reality of what we saw in manufacturing. We lost 1 out of 3 manufacturing jobs in just over a decade. And it was started by NAFTA and kind of turbocharged by the China agreement as well. And that is a swift, sudden decline. And a lot of Americans may not have seen or felt that right away, but the communities in which these workers were located are still feeling the effects and still reeling from them. And there's been follow-on research that has shown that the social and economic impacts of all of this have been incredibly devastating, and that there's higher divorce rates, there's lower connections with community, there's more deaths of despair, there's lower opportunity for wages, there's a lot of flight of young people out, and so you name it, basically, the societal ill, and we've seen it, and this also promoted political extremism as well. And so it has been a contributing factor to that. And so when you add all of that up, that's been obviously a good deal for a very small subset of America and a terrible deal for most manufacturing, for most workers, and all of this. And I just want to share just a little vignette. I was traveling with one of my sons across the country last summer, and we stopped in Little Rock, Arkansas. We went to the Clinton Library. And I thought it'd be kind of cool. And we're walking through it. I remember Socks the Cat. That was pretty great. And the saxophone was pretty cool. And the peace accord, there was a lot of hope with all of that. And the peace and the prosperity and all of that was great. And then we got to the little alcove on international economic policy, and I lost my shit. And I was like, oh, this is how I spent my 90s. Fighting against NAFTA, and then fighting against trade promotion authority, fast track authority that had no protections for workers, and then fighting against the giveaway to China, and then the Battle of Seattle, and all of this, and then I think we did win a couple of things as well, like the multilateral agreement on investments. I think they mentioned in there as well. And my dad was like, "Dad, you're gonna get us thrown out of this place. You're like yelling really loud." And I was like, "But the point is that philosophy, unfortunately, was very baked in, to both parties, to both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and it was there for a very long time. And I'll just close with this: it was also perpetuated by corporations in a number of different ways. I mean, the members of Congress who would generally rise to become the leaders of the committees that did this were blessed by these corporations more often than not. That applies to some of the party leadership on both sides too. That applies to the presidential candidates on both sides. That applies to the advisory committees that USTR has on all of this as well. And so when you looked across the board, and obviously these corporations were funding all of this economic research, which has been debunked, about how great all of this would be. And so so there is a reckoning now, and I know that we'll get to that, but I think that it was helped to crystallize in part by the pandemic, when people faced shortages and a real crisis, and there were some real life and death situations, just about how fragile and corrupt this whole system was. And I think that helped to create the space, along with this desperation and the overwhelming body of evidence, and then also the fact that, you saw some in the Republican Party that picked up this issue and co-opted, I think, working class voters that way as an alarm bell, that we got to act differently than we have been.
Thank you very, very much, Scott. I'll just tell you a very quick vignette, if I can, here. You were talking about being in the library and, and losing it, etc. It was my husband, Stan Greenberg, and I. Well, he's come over to my side, but we were out to dinner with one of my daughters, and I can remember the restaurant was the Bombay. It was an Indian restaurant, and she said, "I'm going to leave because the two of you are shouting at one another about," I said, "you can't be for NAFTA, and so forth." But the view that, and it's only recently where we have, he said, as I said, he's come to my side of the equation here. But I think we had, no one believed when we just relayed what would happen. And it happened, which allowed us then, when we were dealing with the loss of those jobs, Connecticut manufacturing jobs to a fare-thee-well, jobs never came back again. The salaries never came back again. And the social consequences, which you laid out there, Scott, but that helped us when we were dealing with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. We had something to look at and say, look at it, look what happened, let's not go down that road again. And that brings me to asking Laurie, and you're right about the biggest corporations getting the benefit of it. Laurie can speak to really, as I say, I think the level of knowledge she has on trade agreements, there's no word for it. It's just overwhelming. But the specific problems with the old trade model and the provisions, the mechanics that allowed corporations to get away with what they did, and look at where we are today in that regard. So, Laurie, take it away.
So it's a pleasure, a thrill to be with my friends and colleagues on this panel. And basically, I think the bottom line of it is that old system of trade agreements concentrated corporate power, increased corporate power, increased monopoly worldwide, was a feature, not a bug. And the specific sort of thing about it that is worth noting, Rosa mentioned this, there are 500 official corporate advisors who have an official role as trade advisors from the Nixon days. That's still there. That needs a study called Loaded at rethinktrade.org, and you can see all of these corporate lobbyists who basically can see the texts, like the TPP when Congress couldn't. It's crazy. So before I explain some of the specific rules very briefly that these corporate interests imposed, I want to say two things about these rules. One, a dirty little secret. A bunch of these NAFTA, WTO, etc. trade rules aren't actually about traditional trade stuff. It's not tariffs and quotas. It is basically a delivery mechanism for all the neoliberal domestic policies of deregulation and special corporate rights that have basically nothing to do with the tariff. And part two is it's enforceable, and each of these agreements has a rule where the domestic laws must be made to conform with these international rules. So it's a means of international preemption. So when democracy is strong and people fight back and get a new Congress and they're going to change the laws, it can have a chilling effect. But also, unlike any other form of international law, please God, this were true for the International Labor Organization's conventions, it's enforceable with sanctions. So it's actually enforceable international law. So that combo, then what rules? Because we've heard the implications have been horrific, and I want to point out it's not just been for the U.S. This has been a corporate coup d'etat via trade agreement on people around the world. These denying the use of these different policy tools, because there are some special new corporate rights that are imposed, and then there are a lot of constraints, handcuffs on governments. This has been a catastrophe in many developing countries. It's not just the rich world. So like exhibit number one, new corporate rights. Okay, free trade agreements, right? What is like the thing you're not supposed to be for? Oh, that would be the government issuing a rent-seeking monopoly license. like, oh, I don't know, a patent. So the WTO and NAFTA, for the first time ever, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, rolling graves, requires every country to issue 20-year patents. Poor countries, rich countries. The U.S. had a 17-year patent on medicines. Big Pharma was trying to get that to 20 years. They couldn't do it in Congress. The consumer groups, et cetera, beat them. Stick it in the WTO, implement the WTO, we have a 20-year patent. Medicine prices went up. And we saw the implications during COVID of having those terrible monopoly patents in a free trade agreement when the developing world couldn't get the damn vaccines that were saving lives here. Like, disgusting. So just exhibit number one. Exhibit number two, the constraints. So agribusiness, incredibly concentrated. I see our friends from Farm Action here. So how has this come to pass? Well, yeah, it's been merger mania and bad antitrust enforcement, but also the damn trade agreement, thumb on the scale, it allows export subsidies, but it forbids most forms of support for local and domestic and small. So you can't do the kind of things we had in the U.S. from FDR on, where you have what's called supply management. It was basically from the Dust Bowl era. How do you have small farmers and reliable, affordable, safe food? We had to chuck that stuff out. We've lost millions of small farms. And guess what? We now have 4 grain trading companies that have 90% of global grain trade. Because their export subsidies, totally kosher under the WTO. Stuff for actual farmers, ixnay. And so you end up having a situation where consumers pay more, farmers get paid less, and these big companies walk away with the profits. And that is part of the deal. So I would just say there's a lot of talk about neoliberalism is dead. And it certainly is wished dead by many, many people, and has certainly with this administration, thank God, many governments are also rethinking. However, a steely skeleton of neoliberal policy imposition remains in place in the carcass of these trade agreements. And part of the answer going forward to have the policy space to do the wonderful things we need to do is to actually fix these old rules, a lot of which really had nothing to do with trade.
Oh, excellent, really. You know, listen, I think you laid it out beautifully. And again, there was nothing for us to juxtapose what we were talking about at that time on NAFTA against anything, but that led us to a renewed strength when we got to the TPP. As I said, it was not an easy road, but we got there. And where we were with USMCA, largely removed the ISDS, corporate, friendly investors, et cetera. And I think we should note on that, because with this current administration, both the President and Ambassador Tai have said that would not be part of any agreements again. However, that is not binding legislation. So when Laurie talks about, this neoliberal notion that if you just open the market, you have free trade, everyone benefits, not the case. Let me just now move to something that is more general. What's next, guys? What is next? What's the vision? And I'm going to ask each of you to comment on that. What is the vision for a progressive, worker-centered trade agreement for all of us? And if you can, I would like, because I'm in the business of trying to legislate, and where can we make a stand on the issues that can bring us to where we want to try to go? Who wants to go first? I'm not. Come on. Don't be shy. This is not a shy crowd. It's all type A personalities up here. Really. Thea, go for it.
Well, I'll make a start because it's a wonderful question. So where do we go from here? I mean, you think about it, we've learned a lot of lessons, and I think that this administration has done an amazing job articulating a worker-centered trade policy. And part of what that means is about who do we choose as partners and what are the key elements that we're looking at. But another piece of it, honestly, is also just having an actual consistent across-the-board enforcement for the worker rights provisions that are in place in trade agreements and in preference programs. And that's something that I think there's more we can do, and we can talk more about that later. But I also want to just highlight the coherence between what we do at home, so the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, where this administration has made a real push to invest in America, but particularly in strategic sectors like clean energy and infrastructure, things where we had underinvested for decades. We kept getting a D+ from the American Society of Civil Engineers for our infrastructure. And so some of that is being rectified, but we're connecting that with good jobs at home, and then we're connecting it with a trade policy, which is also supportive of doing that. And I think that's just a really important piece of it, which is that if we want to build a clean solar supply chain in the United States and in countries that don't use slave labor, we need to invest because we're behind. We spent decades outsourcing everything and letting China buy up all these key sectors and other countries who are not, and now we have these problems. And so if we want to overcome the first mover, the economies of scale, the subsidies, and the forced labor, we're going to need to use trade policy as well as industrial policy, as well as our investments and our training in order to have a chance at being successful. And I think that's the direction we need to go.
Okay, great. Good job. Lori?
I think that we're starting to see an important shift with this administration, not just in the actual policies, but in the thinking, which is to say, first comes the goal of an economy, and it's much more focused on delivering for people. And then the question is, what tools do that? And it's both domestic tools and it is trade tools. And the trade tools are part of the answer of things we can use to try and deliver the goals. So I would say there's like a three-part, at a high level, way to think about it. First, stop digging the hole. So the administration is not doing more of the same so-called free trade agreements where you just have basically doing more agreements and having more trade volume as the goal, regardless of what that does for income, what that does to communities, what that does for the security of supplies of essential goods or the safety of food or the treatment of people in the supply chain. So that's part of it, but also they're still cleaning up the mess and not digging in the hole. So I want to call out the Biden administration basically removing the proposals from the Trump administration that I'm sad to say the Obama folks had kind of pushed forward too on so-called digital trade. These were rules that were going to let big tech pull the same stunt that big pharma did, which is they were going to have new rights and guarantees like special secrecy that would totally conflict with the administration's AI oversight executive order, where, of course, you want to preview this stuff for civil rights and civil liberties violations to make sure it's not going to be AI run amok. It'd be new secrecy rights. It would be like basically the FDA being told by the pharmaceutical companies, you can't look at our medicine, but just trust us. So that was in there. The administration realized that's inconsistent with what they're trying to do. They stopped that. Or there was a rule that would undermine privacy. There was a rule that would undermine competition, certainly the bipartisan bills in Congress, but even the enforcement that we're seeing FTC and DOJ do. So that was great. Stop digging, put down shovel, turn around, all of that. Number two is there is a whole set of restructuring we need to focus on the kind of economy we want to deliver for people, where they have affordable, safe supplies of the things they need to keep themselves healthy and happy, be it food and medicine, be it key services like health care, but also that communities are rebuilt and strengthened and that people have the dignity of work, have the ability to have, for the 60% of Americans who don't have a college degree in the workforce today, that's the number, it's 60%. We're not just going to college degree our way out of this. And for everyone to have a job that adds value and gives them a standard of living that actually delivers what they need for themselves. And so if you start with that vision, then what are the tools? Well, we're seeing, for instance, some of the domestic policies, but you have international policies. I'm going to say the T word. Sometimes you need a tariff because you have to block unfair imports from coming in. If you invest in the Inflation Reduction Act, both on generating consumer demand with those tax credits, but also with the manufacturing tax credits to develop some particular capacities here in key things we need going forward, well, then you have to make sure the unfair stuff isn't coming here to crush your investment. And that is part of the deal. We have tools that have been used in the past regularly, different supply management tools, commodity agreements, the old-fashioned multi-fiber arrangement, where we set up pockets of countries who agreed to certain standards and we doled out market share. Literally, should we decide we need 4 or 5 redundant markets to make pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceutical ingredients worldwide? What is that number? So that because of climate, because of a pandemic, because of an earthquake, something goes down. Same for our communications technologies, our green energy technologies. We're going to have to structure those markets. And efficiency, as we've learned the hard way, in the sense of efficiency at its highest scale is a monopoly, and then it becomes highly inefficient, maximally inefficient. We can't just continue that way. So, and then the third thing is removing some of these old rules, which, thank goodness, has started, for instance, with ISDS, but it's a long project.
Scott.
Thank you. I agree with what Thea and Lori have said. I want to add just a couple of thoughts. First, I want to second the idea of tariff as a tool for social and economic justice and for growth coupled by other policies that can be broadly shared bottom up and middle out, and that's what this kind of industrial policy coupled with that tariff is trying to do, so that we're not just trading kind of like a carbon source produced by oligarchs with clean energy that's produced with slave labor by an autocratic state that may not have our interests at heart. So that I think we need to continue that rationale. The second thing that I think is important that we do is that as there's obviously a strategic shift going underway, and diplomacy traditionally was a primary goal of trade policy for many years post-World War II. And we don't need to go into the whole history, and it kind of evolved as corporations saw what the opportunity were in some of these emerging markets. The rationale behind that kind of disappeared after with the end of the Cold War, but is reemerging again. Clearly with this concern about China. So as we're doing that, we need to be careful not to use trade as a tool that can be exploited by corporations and used primarily also for diplomatic purposes in a way that's going to have detrimental economic impacts in the United States. I think that's important as well. As we're conducting industrial policy, we need to make sure that there's fierce competition. And that there are performance standards, that we're not just doing handouts to companies, but that they need to use well-paid workers. They need to respect the right to organize. They need to pay attention to what kind of benefits are being provided in the community. And that way there will be a benefit for the companies and for American consumers and workers at the end of this. And just finally, and the last thing, because this is a group that cares deeply, I know, about competition and monopolies. We need to take back the language from, I think, the free trade neoliberal crowd and these corporations, is that the consumer is at the center of their concern, which is kind of the Bubba or myth that they perpetuated for 30 years now,
right,
that
right.
You guys hate consumers. You want to do all sorts of bad things to this with
right.
tariffs and by not denying these opportunities. Well, that is BS, obviously, and we know it's BS. But we need to kind of reclaim the idea that we care deeply about people not only as consumers but as citizens, as workers, as stakeholders in a broader community, and that they also tend to pass along cost savings and revenue on a short-term basis, but mostly to their shareholders. They're always going to pass along price increases, but that's beside the point. But at any rate, so there is a lot of work to do, but we have a different playing field than we did before, and that's thanks to a lot of great work that folks up here did.
I would just say a thank you to you all on this issue. I mean, I look at tools. I want to take what you are saying and translate it into, where we can take the public policy initiatives to move forward. And one of the areas that has been comes with, the issue of the CHIPS legislation. And while we are providing something, $52 billion to manufacturers to bring back, an industry here. On the other hand, I think we need to take a look at, and what we're trying to do is deal with an outbound review mechanism. So to not allow us to offshore technology, particularly to China and so forth. And in many respects, that is being fought by the very industries that are getting the beneficiaries of the $52 billion. So what we need to do is to understand that, yes, in terms of what policy we have and with the administration, is that it's not, yes, we need to work with our trading partners, but we should not be, once again, selling off our technology or whatever else. And I think that there's a need to really focus, to galvanize around, an effort in that regard and stand up for it. At the moment, I think the administration and the de minimis closing that loophole is critical. And I think what we need to do is to identify and prioritize some of these efforts, and whether it is through executive order, whether it is through various agencies, whether it's Treasury or Commerce or whatever it is, that they have to be on board as well to understand how we're going forward. We have, we're looking at a totally different administration, but I think we have places where we can really tighten up some of the things that we are trying to accomplish in order to make our trade agreements what they should be for the future. You've gotten a little bit into this, but the issue of obstacles. This is not, we're not Pollyanna, going forward here. There are still considerable obstacles. It's great. Vision is terrific of where we want to go, but where do those obstacles exist, and how are we going to push back and really look at a stronger countervailing, worker-centered strategy in doing this. Let's be quick about that. I don't know what our timing is, but what the hell? Let's just go. Let's just answer. Really, I mean, because I think it's important. Washington, the window doesn't open for very long. We have a window at the moment to move through this and to try to make our voices heard, to deal with specific policy where we can change the way things have been done. We have started on that road, so let's continue. Quickly, obstacles that we need to try to overcome in this effort. Laura, go ahead.
Speed round. So shorthand for we need to build power and bottom-up power and bring together the diverse audiences that are here: small business people, independent farmers, labor union activists, people who care about the environment, etc. I mean, if you just even think about the fact that we need to have resilient supplies to beat the climate crisis of, say, the solar panels, that when China got angry with us, they just cut us off with the supply. So, if you're coming from the climate perspective, think of it that way. If you're coming from the union perspective, think about good union jobs making the stuff here. If you're coming from the business perspective, think of the supply chain you can invest in. And I just want to call out Arthur Stamolis, who's the head of Citizens Trade Campaign. See him if you want to know how to get involved campaigning. He has grassroots coalitions across the country who are basically the field troops behind General DeLauro when we have these major fights. So please see Arthur. I think another thing just to flag is sort of I think a great guidebook is we have a study out on the table that we did at AELP on the CHIPS bill.
Okay.
Good stuff in the right direction, but what Rosa has pointed out is every single kind of issue we're concerned about. So like the money should go to new entrants as well as to the existing companies. If the existing companies are getting money, there should be conditions that they are not being anti-competitive. There should be no stock buybacks. There should be labor and organizing requirements. So some of these conditions, for a variety of reasons, didn't make it into round one. But that study helps lay out the kinds of things that we can be fighting for together. And then just, when you had asked originally, what is it exactly of the new rules, one of the things I ran out of time to say, but in the international structure, I just want to underscore what Thea was saying, which is if we establish a floor of decency, of, for instance, the existing International Labor Organization standards, the existing multilateral environmental agreement standards. As Rosa's fought for decades, if that's the floor that international trade operates on, then we have a possibility to have to actually lift up economies around the world.
Okay, speed run. So I think, first of all, I would say what's been successful has been linking labor rights to trade agreements, both the Tariff Act of 1930, which bans the import of goods made in whole or in part with forced labor, which has been a game changer in terms of corporate accountability throughout their supply chain, whether they've outsourced everything, whether they know about it or they don't know about it. They are actually responsible for not having forced labor anywhere in their supply chain. And that is really important, and it's really powerful, and we should use it more. The other thing is the USMCA labor provisions have been extraordinary because we were able to completely turn around a failed trade agreement, NAFTA, and turn it into something powerful for working people, to empower workers to be able to form independent democratic unions. Around 30,000 workers in Mexico have a union, a real union now, that they didn't have because we were able to use the trade agreement as a force for good, as a way of empowering workers, as a way of shifting the balance of bargaining power from multinational corporations to working people. And the last obstacle I would just say is that this country, and actually around the world, there is such a strong anti-union bias and prejudice. And this is a moment when corporations are on the hook. I mean, you see it every single day. You pick up the gosh darn newspaper and you see some horrific labor abuse. And these are big name corporations. They're auto companies, they're apparel companies, and yet they have this because they're wasting their money on third-party audits, almost $30 billion a year, because they don't want a union. You know, you can pay a bunch of auditors, expensive people in suits, to fly around the world and stay in fancy hotel rooms and show up announced at a factory and not find any problems. Or you could have a darn union that's there 7 days a week, that is elected and democratic and trusted by the workers, and you might not have to worry about those kinds of abuses. So if we can overcome that prejudice, I think we could make a ton of progress.
Here we go. Scott.
I'll just be very brief. I think there's a great opportunity for kind of transpartisan, kind of trans-ideological collaboration on this. And we've all experienced this in the past in fighting against trade agreements, and I think it could be very powerful if wielded the right way. So I just want to encourage people to be open to that as well.
Just a couple final comments here. And Laurie referenced Arthur. Let me just take what happened with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was this was an inside-outside endeavor, if you will. There was the organization around the country, through a field effort and raising awareness and people writing, calling, and doing what they need to do. Internally, there was the education of members of Congress about what this was about, and very specifically what it was about. I would venture to say today that what we need to do is to engage the Congress on how we want to go forward, and not sit back and say we renegotiated the NAFTA agreement, we got some good things, and that's where we're going to leave it. We cannot afford to do that. And this is the moment to try to engage with Congress, engage with the advocacy groups outside of the unions and others, the environmental groups, the broad coalition that we try to bring together in the Trade Working Group, to make it possible for people to understand what is at stake. I don't think that because we haven't had a fight like we did with NAFTA or with TPP, that we are at a moment where people truly in the Congress, some do obviously, but don't understand what is happening and how we have the ability to turn it around. I will just say something. I was in the room with 6 of us and with the trade people, the Trump trade people, and we're debating forced labor. You get, how in the hell could we, as the United States of America, be having a conversation? No. There's no forced labor. That's it. It's not going to be equivocated in any way. But that's the kind of...
Only if it's not too expensive.
Right. You know, but that's where we have to go. Listen, we are woefully out of time here and so forth. But I just want to say, you really are listening to panelists who live and breathe these issues every day. Their public service and that commitment is so apparent in the knowledge, the commitment, the compassion for these issues. So I'm so pleased to be with them. And what I really want to leave people with is we have a moment when we need to take on corporations, 55 of whom pay 0 taxes, another 39 who don't pay. How does this translate to trade? Yes, they are there, they are in force, and they're going to try to push us back. We cannot allow it to happen to us again. And if we don't do that now, then we will have opened the door to going backward rather than to go forward. And I hope people are, you know, fired up really in a way that corporations, we have to hold them accountable and not have abusive trade policy for their own goals. So with that, let's try to galvanize the Congress. Let's try to organize outside and do it. Thank you. Thank you, one and all. Appreciate
Hear,
it.
hear. Thank you to the whole panel.